Hey guys, in this video I will show you how you can paint rusty and corroded metals on your miniatures, including all the little color tricks and shortcuts I use to do them easier, faster, but still awesome looking. These days everyone and their mother is painting clean and shiny non-metallic metal, but clean and shiny won't cut it when you are painting something dedicated to the god of decay. And you might be thinking that non-metallic metal is hard enough already, a corroded and nasty version of it must surely be even more difficult, but you would be wrong. In fact, the opposite is true. So in this video I will show you how you can paint two types of corroded metals using my recently painted Blight Kings as an example. I have already shown you how to paint the vibrant green armor on them, so check out the video from 2 weeks ago if you want to see that, but in this one I will focus on only the metals. And if you want to know how to paint every single thing on these guys, check out my Patreon for all the PDF guides and the real-time painting footage about this project so you can follow along and paint your own. I will show you both the rusty steel or iron and the more reddish metals, something like bronze or copper, and the reason we are doing both is because they are connected. I will be using some of the same colors to paint both, making things faster but achieving a result where the two are distinct but integrate with each other nicely at the same time. So let's dive right into it and start with the iron. I begin from a simple black base coat and I use whole red as my first color, simply covering most of the surface and only leaving a tiny bit of the black behind in the deepest recesses. And you might be confused now because I said that we would start with the iron, but this reddish brown color is far from the dark grays you would probably expect me to use for this type of metal. Just wait until you see the next colors, but let me explain this one first. I use the reddish brown because what we are painting right now will serve as the shadow of our metal later on. It might look relatively bright now, but it will be some of the darkest colors on these elements, and we want to give a hint of rustiness and corrosion in those darker areas. We will use this later on to build some rust effects on top of it. But we can worry about that later on. For now I simply cover most of the black with this using a big size 2 brush so I can go fast because at this point I don't have to worry about precision too much. For the next color I will mix some dark olive green into the same whole red, mixing them about evenly, and I use this mix to do the same again, but now covering a little less surface and leaving some of the pure whole red around it visible. The difference between this and the previous layer is not huge, but that means that they blend together quite easily and I don't have to worry about blending them together myself. And why green? Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. For one, desaturated green colors are a great way to paint corroded and nasty looking metals. But in addition to that, consider that these guys are wearing green armor, and while these metals will be corroded and nasty, they will still reflect some of the things around them. So by making them greenish, they will fit right in with the green armor and the general environment around them, so they will look more natural and fitting for this scene. Finally, the green contrasts nicely with the red and the orange tones in the shadows and the rust effects, and contrast in general is a good thing, whether it's value contrast or color contrast like this one. So that means that green tones are just perfect for what we want to achieve, and I will be using a couple of them until I add another unexpected color in the end. And in that spirit, let's use some pure olive green next and use it to start working on the midtones and establish our main highlights. So far I was using a big brush and went quite fast and without too much precision, but now things are becoming a little bit more important to get right, so I switch to a size 1 brush and I do a couple of important things. I edge highlight every single edge with this color. I don't try to make these highlights super thin or precise for now, in fact it's better to make them thicker at this stage, but I do them everywhere. I also do bigger highlight areas on larger surfaces and I cover these fully with this color, but leaving some of the previous reddish tones around it. To know where to place these, it's important to understand where the light is supposed to come from, and those who watched the green armor video might remember that I painted the armor assuming that the light is coming from above the left shoulder of the models. So now I have to paint the metals using the same light direction to make everything look nice and consistent. Wherever I paint something, I ask myself where the light would hit that element if the light comes from that direction. And where I think that place would be, I paint a solid highlight covering about 50% of that surface. But around the solid highlight I make small scratches and random marks with the tip of the brush using the same green color. These will make the metal even more worn looking, but they will also help me hide the transition between the two colors better. Finally, I use some glazes of the same color and sometimes the previous ones to smooth out the transition. Dragging a couple of thin layers of this over the scratches and marks is enough to integrate things together. This process might seem complicated, but if you have this down, you will be able to paint not only this metal, but almost everything else as well. So remember, edge highlights, solid highlights, scratches and marks on the border, and a glaze to smooth things over. Okay, now let's put that into practice and repeat what we have just done, but let's make the highlights brighter and brighter, but smaller and smaller at the same time. First, I'll mix about 50% medium sea gray into the olive green. Yes, we are finally adding some of those gray colors that you would expect from metals, but we will still keep them greenish. At this point, it's worth switching to a smaller brush again, for example a size 0 instead of the size 1 I have been using so far. The smaller and brighter the highlights are, the more precise we need to make them. The main difference between this and the previous step, other than the size of the area I'm covering, is where I paint my edge highlights. Instead of painting every edge, now I'm only painting the edges that face our imaginary light coming from above and the left. If the edge faces that direction, it gets painted with this color, and if not, I'll leave it as it is. Next, I will switch to pure medium sea gray and repeat the same process again, but now I'm painting even smaller highlights and I'm restricting which edges I paint even more. Where the edge is not fully facing the light, I just paint it partially and I finish the highlight with a couple of dots. Blending the transition between this and the previous color is also becoming a little bit more difficult, since now I'm dealing with a more whitish tone. So I make even more and smaller nicks and marks on the edges of the transitions, and I spend a little bit more effort blending them together with glazes of the previous color. But I don't spend too much time on this. I still want to go relatively fast. I have 5 models to paint after all, and we want this metal to look dingy and worn anyway. Plus, I will use a little trick later to smooth things out. Okay, time to switch things up a little. Instead of continuing with the gray tones, I will use a very bright yellowish color instead. Ice yellow will work perfectly for this. And the reason I'm doing it is because I want this yellow to contrast with the greens, and by doing so look even brighter than it actually is. Also, if you look at the armor, you can see that it has some yellowish highlights giving a feeling of warm light reflecting on it. So I want to replicate this feeling on the metals to bring everything together. Little things like this that make everything more cohesive do a lot more than you might think for making your models look good in the eyes of the observer. The method is the same as before though, but now I'm really making things small, thin and crisp as much as I can using a size 00 brush. Finally, with pure white, I only paint some of the edges that are the most exposed to the light, and even those just partially most of the time. I only do some super small solid highlights inside the previous ones, and in most places I only place edge highlights and nothing else. And this is how the gang looks at this stage, but we are not done yet. Remember that I told you that the two metals are connected? Now it's time to make that happen. We can finish this one while doing the other. I gave all the bits that were supposed to be bronze a very dark purple base coat way back when I was painting the green armor. Now I use redskin shadow to cover most of the surface, leaving the dark purple only in the deepest shadows. This start is very similar to the one I used on the iron, but this color is a little bit more saturated than the whole red I used there. But now things are becoming more interesting. I switched to beast brown for my next highlight, and I use it for 3 things. First of all, I take care of the bronze bits. I do edge highlights on them everywhere, and I add big solid highlights covering about 70% of the previous color, remembering to keep the light direction again coming from the top left. But I don't use this only on the bronze, I also do 2 other steps on the iron as well. So I thin this color down with some additional water and I glaze it into the midtones and the shadows of the iron elements. There it blends nicely with the greenish reddish shadow tones and adds to the rusty effect. I also drop the slightly thicker version of this under some rivets and into the little holes of the armor and the iron bits, dragging it down with the tip of the brush as if the rusty water would drip down from where it was pooling. Then I switched to a brighter orange tone and I repeated the same process using it for the same 3 things, but now making it even smaller, thinner and more subtle. It is important to keep the previous color still visible around the new one, otherwise we are just repeating the same steps, making everything brighter and brighter, but destroying all the contrast in the process. I also painted this in some of the rings of the chainmail as if it was rusting, and on the greenish iron weapons I made some random marks and dots with the tip of the brush, adding random rusty spots on the blades and on the bell. Then, moving even brighter with light rust, I continue with the same method but on an even smaller area and even finer and crisper. I do the usual technique of painting solid highlights in the most valid area, then scratches and marks on the borders, finally a glaze to smooth it out. And just like with the brighter colors on the iron, I start to concentrate my edge highlights only on the edges which would be hit by the light and leave the others darker. I keep adding more dripping down rust effects and little rust marks on the iron bits and the armor as well, but now I don't do the glazing step anymore in the shadows, this color is too bright for that. And with this, the iron bits and the rust effect on the armor is basically done. The bronze bits also look quite nice, but they still need some final touches to make them really look good and also corroded. So now it's time to mix a little white into our oranges to do the highlights. This will push the brightness a lot, but it will also desaturate everything, so I have to be very careful how big I make the highlights with it. This means that from this point on I drastically reduce the size of the solid highlights and focus more on the edge highlights. And I concentrate most of those on the edges directly facing the light, sometimes only painting a part of the edge. And just like with the iron, when I get to this point I have to be way more precise than on the initial layers, because paints with lots of white in them will stand out so much more from their surroundings. So any mistake I make at this stage will be quite obvious. A small size 00 brush helps a lot with this. Basically in the beginning I don't need that much precision and I can go fast with a big brush. but as the highlights get brighter and brighter, I want to be more and more precise. So to achieve this, I sacrifice speed and switch to smaller and smaller brushes during the highlighting process. For the next step, I will be using ice yellow again for some still yellowish but bright highlights. I do mostly just edge highlights with this, except on the bigger surfaces where there is still some space left for some small solid highlights. It is important to really reduce the area I cover with this color, or it will be too easy to lose the saturated colors from the metal because of all the white this contains. And speaking of white, for the final highlights I use tiny amounts of this to only paint some partial edges and corners in the most valid areas. And with this the highlights are done, but there is still one more thing we can do to make this look better. Just like I finished the iron bits with some corrosion effects, we need a little extra grime and nastiness on this as well because it still looks too clean. So I took some dark sea blue and I glazed this into the shadow areas to deepen them and add a little greenish blue tint there. This is basically the same thing as using the darker orange colors to glaze some rustiness into the iron, but instead of rust I am simulating some oxidization on the bronze. And the greenish blue tones contrast nicely with the oranges around them, but at the same time they make it look like the green armor is reflecting a little on the metal. Not to mention that this helps smooth out the midtones and the shadows too, so it's a win all around. Now I use some lighter blue-green tones to make it look like the green oxidization is dripping down from around some elements and from holes where it was pooling. I use the tip of the brush to place a little bit of slightly thinned down paint around the rivet or into an indentation, and then I drag it down as if it was seeping down from that spot. When I am happy with that, I use an even brighter color to do the same, but even smaller and finer, so the previous colors are still visible around it. And with that, the metal bits are finished and the end result looks like this. I have painted corroded metals before, but so far this is definitely my favorite iteration, and it was fairly fast too, considering that I spent only a few hours and I painted 5 models at the same time. But let me know what you think of them in the comments, I'm curious how you like them. And if you want to know how I painted everything else on these boys, you can check out the guides on my Patreon, and let me know in the comments if you're interested in how I made the scenic base, because I'm still considering if it's worth a video. But for now, I hope you have learned something while watching, and if you like the video, do me a solid and subscribe, like and comment, it really helps with the algorithm showing it to other people. And as usual, before I sign off, I wanted to thank my Patreon members for all their support. Without them, this channel wouldn't exist, and that is especially true for the ones in the captain level. Thank you guys, see you in the next one.